I'd like to acknowledge all our Indigenous people and traditional owners of this land here that we're on today in Aotearoa. Thanks for bringing me over here, Sarah. It's a real honour. So I'm going to talk about this, Like a Whale Song, ? Decolonising Indigenous Design Futures. So I'm from this place here, the Gold Coast, or Yugambeh country, or Bunjalung country, which is now down the road from Brisbane. My Aboriginal heritage is Gamilaroi, a little bit further down again, in Armidale. And obviously I've got a suite of bastardry European heritage as well. This is an interesting map. I would call this a decolonial map or decolonial cartography, which is a whole area that's really interesting that I don't have time to go into. But you might get a sense of why this is an interesting map. So I see whales pass by home every year like you do here as well, I'm sure. And it's really good because I feel as though the numbers look to be increasing, which is fantastic. We also have this beautiful whale hall in Brisbane in our state museum. And in this hallway, there's these massive whales, and we all grow up with them when we go to school. We kind of end up on school trips to this place, and we walk under these whales. And I was going to get fancy and now cue the whale song, but I'm not. So you walk under these whales and you hear the whale song at the same time. So we're fascinated by whales, us humans. And as I was researching for this talk, I found myself in the vortex of this whale song. It's a really beautiful kind of sonic vibe to research to write, by the way. In fact, there's been a platinum album, Songs of the Humpback Whale, back in the 1970s. That's how fascinated we are with whale song. So researchers use all kinds of technological devices like hydrophones and buoys to capture and decode the whale's song. We get to hear the whale song because of these technological devices. They make it nice to hear because in that anthropocentric process of representation, we inescapably reduce it to something that makes sense to us, humans. This is our techno-mediation of their world, rendered as a narrative to our world. And it's the only tools that we have to engage as we yearn for what is nice to hear. So too, the structural science of early anthropology relied on technological devices to render a colonial image of indigenous worlds. Ethnomusicology, for example, searched for commensurability under Eurocentric terms, as the colonizer yearned for meaning in unknown lands. And I'm sure that you all know that there was a lot more worse kinds of probing going on than just ethnomusicology, which I don't have time to talk about here. Of course, the difference is we humans, have continuously throughout history co-opted and liberated the tools of the oppressor. Conversely, the whale can't turn the hydrophone on the human, as far as we know. So, for example, in the 1800s, First Nations people in Australia, prohibited from cultural dance, would instead perfect public performances that mocked and commented and critiqued their settler spectators. So in order to be engaged, remunerated, and communicate resistance, they co-opted the dominant narrative. They participated in dance under Eurocentric terms, under the gaze, the language of the oppressors. And the dance and song then became nice to hear to the colonizer because it could be perceived as a spectacle of entertainment that made sense to them. So from India's going forward into contemporary settings, in India's Jugaad repair culture, Brazilia's Gambiarra repair culture, there are endless examples of innovative repair cultures constituted by billions of people across the globe, making do with what's at hand with available technologies, contesting productivist models that have colonised their geographies. And so too, Examples such as from the American Great Depression to Cold War Russia to more recently Papua New Guinea illustrate how famine, conflict, and oppressive regimes have designed conditions where groups innovate, hack, remake, reframe. In other words, they liberate tools and technologies for their own decolonizing or counter neoliberalist means. And so here we are today, over in my country in Australia, where some purport that the technological tool of social media is being liberated from the oppressor for the means of increased intergenerational family connections amongst colonial dispossession and disconnection from land. Advocates argue it becomes a safe space to share identity among your filter bubble, away from conflict, and also a tool of galvanizing resistance. And a lot of that might be true. So in other words, the argument is that it liberates the hurt from the loss of colonization of geographies because it provides groups with a new connection to virtual geographies and ecologies that can be held as sacred space. And this techno-mediation of worlds, amplified by Indigenous groups for means of healing, also becomes celebrated as a reconciliation tool, where two worlds can meet in the common language of a virtual world. A win-win situation where the colonized co-opts the techno-mediation on offer, a portal to their world, while the colonizer is provided with a commensurable view. This betweenness, this bridging, sounds seductive. It is. In fact, modernity is seductive. However, its darker side, colonialism, is repressive too. The colonized are seduced into being co-opted into this bridging tool, and seldom may they have a say otherwise, for the tools at hand for the largest shout are increasingly through these terms. And so it goes that it risks repressing other modes of being, expressing, and communicating other worlds. It risks performing actually a reversal of the kinds of ontological design qualities originally intended by groups struggling for decolonial futures. So sound warnings ironically reverberate in the colonizer's ear like a whale's song. Nice to hear, so long as it's reduced and represented to a gaze through a technological device. So what I've outlined so far seems to be a dialectic of technology for liberation. On one hand, the perceived amplification of freedom, a decolonizing mechanism. On the other, a giving away to a modern world system of aesthetics, typology, and interactivity inbuilt into techno-mediated ecologies, a colonization of minds mechanism. On the latter, Arturo Escobar, a leading decolonial theorist who's recently turned his attention to decolonizing design, uses the term the one world story, and he writes, there's been a massive delocalization fostered by digital technologies and ICTs, where a techno-economic intervention is a domination of a locality. This delocalization and domination point towards designing the one world story into spaces, which degrades relationships to place that had been present for many millennia before. And this creation of the one world story, of course, means that something is also always destroyed, the dialectic of creation and destruction. Tony Fry, a leading design philosopher who has turned his attention recently to decolonial theory and started talking to Escobar, states, the mobilization of modern and advanced technologies dismisses and in the past has discredited traditional and ancient technologies. So put simply, the one world story emanating from the global north diminishes options from multiple worlds in the entire global south, 80% of the global population, who are robbed of fostering different relationships with their own technologies under their own terms. And so we're really at this interesting moment where the one world story is now also commonly felt in society as taking us towards the AI, post-human story. And for some, this comes with that unsettling feeling of the threat to the human species as we know it. So herein lies a moment in history, right now, in this decade, that is perhaps a clash not just of civilizations, but of being human itself, in which the fictional Brave New World enters perceptual reality, in which we, humans, no longer be the only player on the field, as biotechnical hybrids, cyborgs, and post-human ontologies emerge. Of course, it's important to remember technology has always been ontologically directive of our human evolutionary change, since man picked up a stone and hit it against another to craft a tool. But this is different. These are biophysical, cognitive, and psychosocial transformations, as Yuval Noah Harari has recently outlined in Homo Deus, in which a widening of the biological and cultural difference will also see the darker side of post-humanism, the abandoned, the have-nots, including between Indigenous groups in the North and South. So, if the one-world story and the post-human story are synonymous, what is contesting this? What might be a catalyst to advocate for a world in which many worlds exist? A world in which biological humans, in their cultural difference, continue being more human. I don't mean the Reebok latest campaign to be more human, although I'm sure their intentions are good. Perhaps Indigenous cultures provide a long-standing template to look towards being more human. Back to our whale. In Australia, Aboriginal worldviews entail a system built over thousands of years that ensures a reciprocal bind to care for the biosphere upon which humans depend. This means for the likes of our whale, it is bound up in a different relationship. Its value is bound up in reciprocity because it imbues human life with symbolic meaning, as it is respected for holding place in a holistic ecology. In return, humans feel a custodianship over the whale in order for the meaning of their life in the same ecology to continue to be imbued. So in this fashion, the whale does have a say in Earth's future. Having human comrades upon which depend on them for meaning renders their existence ensured. In the one world system that brought forth the Anthropocene that we exist in today, the whale gets very little say, and when it does, it's nice to hear through a technological device. As can be seen in an inordinate numbers of animal species extinct, and various whale species too, just being human in the current one world system doesn't seem to be enough to protect this whale. But there's also an argument that being post-human is only going to compound the threat. Here's one way that that could unfold. So in a post-human future, a clear perception of a human dependence on that biosphere, on that whale, on nature, diminishes. Its value becomes less about reciprocal care and more about capturing the spectacle of the idea of the whale. The biophysical whale is not necessarily needed for this to occur. Through the techno-mediation afforded by emerging virtual simulations of the whale, the post-human can continue the Cartesian dualism from which it derives and create virtual realities to quench any symbolic meaning needed for the interaction between humans and nature. This ontological unfolding risks diminishing any real imperative to actually maintain the biosphere, the whale, and conversely posits an increased imperative to maintain better, more hyper-real virtual simulations of it. This future narrative amounts to a neo-colonization, enslavement, and commodification of culture and nature by hyper-consumptive cyborgs, ontologically directing the advancement of the diminishment of other ways of being in the world. Of course, this narrative assumes there is time for all of this to occur. Another future narrative in this fragile age of the Anthropocene may well be that due to climate change and global unsettlement, the biosphere upon which humans depend shortly falls apart, forcing us towards this technocentric regime anyway that demands less dependence on the biosphere. So, to many, including myself, we're standing at the peak of a mountain. Behind us, Indigenous groups have been robbed by modernity in the past, and in front, the neo-colonisation of minds by an oversaturation of techno-mediation risks rapidly robbing human options of a world in which many worlds coexist. Worlds that increase possibilities for humans to survive. Escobar shares a similar caveat. Groups, he says, are being left with little option to design their worlds under the inescapable techno-economic mediation of their worlds. To compound this neo-colonising future narrative, a whole area beyond what I have space to extrapolate on here is also beginning to be discussed, which is the embodied robotic and AI tools in this new era are embroiled as sites of racialization too. Put simply, to what extent can faces, as faces, be conceptualized in race-less terms? So, also beyond the time that I have to discuss today is a reflection on how our relationship with things over the past couple hundred years has brought forth these conditions in which we find ourselves. This is a map I created a year ago or so to try and comprehend this myself. There's a full paper there that speaks about it, but it's crucial to the picture to see where we might be headed. And I've previously discussed it using these key threads: concealment, newness, techne, and care. The summation of which is a proliferation of concealed, new, consumer-driven objects and things, particularly since the first Industrial Revolution, coupled with a disassociation from reflective action due to the spectacle of social and media technologies colonising our attention, has brought forth a deterioration of care for being human in a physical reality and locality bound in a dependence on the biosphere. And as I was making this set of slides, I had a revelation of a moment when I realised this looks like a whale's tail. So maybe I need to play with this metaphor some more. I also create maps like this to help Indigenous groups. Of course, Indigenous groups' relationships with technology is plural, but it would be at least safe to say it very seldom explicitly seeks to adopt the one world narrative. I am, however, interested in assisting groups understand the implicit affordances of choosing to adopt techno-mediation relationships, the kinds of future directions I've discussed, from hyper-consumptive cyborgs to the underclass and the abandoned. These are directions groups deserve to understand, so they might select the way they fuse their worlds with things based on the knowledge of the ontological gathering of that fusion into the future, which may well be either creating or destroying their human futures, their human cultures. So now I'd like you to consider what I've discussed so far as I turn to a few ways Indigenous groups in Australia are building relationships with technology. So as I pointed out at the beginning of this talk, social media affords positive benefits to community. However, researchers also noted forms of abuse were also the key challenges identified in Indigenous people using social media. In fact, the marginalised are always the highest status rate of people being abused. So just thinking about that, coupled with some of the other negative side effects that I've been speaking about, there's a right for us to ask, where is a decolonial designing and human futuring proposition of social media actually going? This is a virtual reality camera. There's a short documentary being built called Collisions, which tells the Aboriginal elder Ngari Ngari's Morgan's story of first contact with Western culture that occurred in 1950, when he witnessed the atomic tests at Maralinga. It tells the story through this virtual reality camera. Lynette Walworth, an Australian artist most well known for her use of interactive technologies to create immersive installations, is the filmmaker using virtual reality technology to take Morgan's Indigenous story to the Sundance Film Festival. So where is the decolonial designing and human futuring proposition of virtual reality going? Remember, colonialism is both seductive and repressive. When our elder, Ngari Ngari, first caught sight of the virtual reality camera, he purportedly quickly recognised its storytelling potential. And pragmatically, he said, "It's got 16 eyes and 4 ears." Walworth cites him as saying, really excitedly. And he's right, and he's wise too. Virtual Songlines aims to immerse users in a landscape and cultural environment that existed before European invasion in Australia. The program combines applied gaming with hardware such as Oculus Rift, virtual reality headsets, to deliver interactive 3D experiences. So based on historical information, it allows users to learn about the spiritual connection between First Nations people and the land by interacting with locally specific virtual environments, they say. The question is this a hyper-real simulation of the interaction between humans, nature, and things? Is it representative of a degraded imperative to actually maintain the biosphere and an increased imperative to capture a simulation of it? Of course, this is not the maker's explicit intentions, though ontological design does not need a designer to explicitly build into a project ontological design. Either way, what is brought into existence will design back on society. So where is a decolonial designing and human futuring proposition of these kinds of online virtual experiences going? The Welcome to Country iPhone app delivers a simple Welcome to Country video introduction to Australian Indigenous culture, including basic protocols that are tribal boundary geospecific. So now people won't need to experience a Welcome to Country. They can just press play. Where is the decolonial designing and human futuring proposition of these online applications going? We're also seeing Indigenous startups, accelerators and innovation hubs, such as what is being proposed in the IndigiLab mission, which is to create a future where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are leading in science and technology and digital innovation. They say that access to the internet and information communications and technologies is important to ensuring quality of life within the 21st century. Some suggest, they say, that the internet and other information communication technologies are somehow transforming society, improving our mutual understanding, eliminating power differentials, realising a truly free and democratic world society, and other benefits. Some of this may be wise and may be right, but let us not forget the dialectic. If this is what is being created, what is being destroyed? Where is the decolonial designing and the human futuring propositions of these kinds of startups going? Really interesting is a surge of interest in what has been coined Indigenous futurism. You guys might have heard it. There's a bit of a movement here, I believe, as well. The term to describe Indigenous science fiction writing, basically. According to Lou Catherine Cornham, a significant book released in 2012 titled Walk in the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction, marked the official inauguration of this field into the mainstream. When I analyse this from a design fiction writing lens, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of as becoming quite a mainstream tool or technique in design practice. This field does offer some interesting futuring potential in a few ways. First of all, like all design fictions, they conceptually test ideas as if they're already in existence without wasting the time, money, and resources they might need to consume in reality. Secondly, design fictions like Indigenous futurism futures test the fusion between people and things without the consequence of bringing that hard-to-separate fusion into actual material existence. And thirdly, as Kate Hartfield writes, it recodes, especially in Indigenous contexts, colonial tropes of interplanetary science fiction writing, such as using words like colonization of other planets to the final frontier. These are rooted in colonial notions of how humans interact with the other, with peoples in other territories. And finally, as Hartfield, through Daniel Heath Justice relays, to which goes to my central argument here, they offer templates of survival, developed in Indigenous storytelling that may very well help all humans navigate the coming decades of climate change, violence, and tyranny. So a design fiction in which we humans do survive, even thrive in futures in which the current structures of oppression have been dismantled, sounds pretty good to me. Indigenous futurism sometimes also amplify traditional ancient technologies that provide options for alternative decolonial worlds, which, as Cornham points out, challenges notions of what constitutes advanced technology and consequently advanced civilizations. Cleverman, an Australian Indigenous Futures TV action drama, reimagines several stories of Aboriginal Dreamtime in a modern super-heroic context and reflects on racism, asylum seekers and border protection. And it tends to resist the techno-utopia of other Indigenous futurism themes, and instead it takes not so much a dystopian one, but a borderland view, amplifying approaches to informal learning, cultures of repair, resilience, resourcefulness in the face of oppression and marginalisation in a future Sydney urban sphere. I'm going to skip past talking about decolonial aesthesis because I'm running a bit out of time, but just look up aesthesis, not aesthetics. Have a look it up. So back to our whale. My central argument on that subject is that the threat of extinction of whales is something humanity is well prepared for. They will remain nice to hear through a technological device. Back to our human subject, the threat of extinction of being human beyond the suite of directions in favour of or on the darker side of post-humanism is well prepared for. The lost cultures will remain nice to hear. Perhaps you can pay some money to plug yourself into a virtual cultural simulation for the day through a technological device. Is that all that remains of culture, of Indigenous futures? And finally, let me be absolutely clear. From the perspective I've outlined, it's not the fab labs, the maker spaces, the apps, accelerators, and all the other technologies that are the problem. It is our unquestioning and giving over to only one of a few directions they can take humanity, which is towards them ontologically designing back on us a universalizing, hyper-consumptive, productivist, techno-deterministic fusion between people and things. And I'll let I.L. Wiseman have the last word. We should see every bit of new technology as a site of struggle. It can be used to either oppress or liberate, sometimes both, but we should never concede anything. Thank you. I think I don't have time for questions, but the hosts will let me know.
Well, we will try to get a couple questions in from the audience if anybody wants to put their hand up. Sarah, I know you'll... Oh, Pritika, I know.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the maps that you've made yourself and how it is that you've created them.
Mm-hmm. So these kinds of maps are usually created as a result of yarning, which is a word in Australia for deep, respectful discussions with Indigenous people. You might have heard yarning circles. You probably have a similar term for it here. So there's two ways that I make these maps. I call them cognitive redirective mapping. The first way is if I'm just cognitively thinking about complexity and I'm working on my own. That's not what this one is. This one is drawing together things with people and listening to those discussions, interacting in those discussions, and trying to find ways to reflect back those discussions in a way that we can all sort of work on, say, the next day and comprehend that complexity and see where it might be taking us. Usually they're very, very messy and then they get cleaned up into some digital format. Sometimes they stay messy. It depends on the context. But behind them is a great deal of theory. I've written a couple of papers about all of that, about sort of the particular steps in order that we take with the mapping process, and the way we try to avoid neutrality in the maps and these other information design traps, you might say, neutrality and fetishizing over sort of data visualization techniques and things like that. But if you look up, cognitive redirective mapping, you'll get the two papers and can have a read.
Any other questions? You're off the hook then.
Thank
Thank you
you
very much, Tristan. We appreciate it.